we've been flying now heavier than air vehicles for what, 120 years, something like that. And we still see a lot of the same problems. A lot of problems with loss of control. For a long time, for decades, the safety statistics were just like a flat line, not getting any better in GA, just every year, the same types of accidents, the same types of things happening. And so we're going to kind of contemplate this together. I've got a list of 10 things. I say it's the 10 things all pilots should know. I hope we get through all 10, but if we don't, that's my website. You guys, like I said, I'm always talking about these very specific things. But I'll ask you, who do you think is really the best at what they do? What does it mean to be the best pilot, right? Is that Bob Hoover shutting off the engines and doing an aerobatic routine, right? Is that a military jet pilot? I mean, what are we striving to be as pilots? What's our real goal? And for most of us, it's not a rhetorical question.
Don't crash.
Don't crash, basically, right? So that's the idea. If you can go flying, take your family flying, take your friends flying, and you can come home safely, you won, right? You're a winner. And that is what we want to strive toward. We want to make sure that every time we go out, we come home safely. So knowing that that's the goal, and knowing that we're not quite there yet, we want to emulate the people who are there. We want to emulate the people that are doing it really, really well. And there's a funny thing I like to contemplate, just to sort of let it sink in about how far we have to go in this arena. But just imagine somebody you love, a child of yours, a spouse, a loved one, doesn't really matter. But that person is on the other side of the country today, say in California, and they call you and say, hey, I decided to come to Oshkosh. I'm going to jump on an American Airlines flight, and I'm going to be arriving, Chicago at, 4 o'clock today. Does anyone feel nervous for their safe arrival? Everyone feels pretty confident that your loved one is going to get there safely. Rightfully so. Now imagine that same person calls you and said, hey, I met this guy named Jim. He's got a Cessna 170 and he's flying out to Oshkosh today. I'm going to jump in with him. What do you think? Right? You guys all laugh, right? Here we are laughing. A lot of you are CFIs, you're subject matter experts, and you're laughing at that thought because you know immediately that's probably not a safe idea. I wouldn't let my daughter jump in a 170 with Jim, right? So that just sort of illustrates how far we have to go to be as safe as the professional operators. And I kind of just gave it away. In my opinion, if coming home safely is the goal, then the professional operators are who we need to emulate. That's because they're doing it very successfully. An actual safety statistic is that over the last 30 years, professional operators as a group have reduced their fatal accident rate by 83%. So they've looked at it. They've focused on it. They've made it a goal. And because that's not an accident. There was a group called CAST, Commercial Aviation Safety Team, that got together and said, how can we do this? How can we effectively reduce the fatal accident rate? And they did it. So let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's not, try to figure it out ourselves. They figured it out for us. So let's just analyze what they're doing and try to figure out how we can apply it to the flying we're doing. So that gets me to number one. The very first thing all pilots should know is this concept I call bracketing safety. Do you guys know what bracketing is? When you're flying a nav signal, like a VOR or something like that, that's where I stole the word from. It's like if this black line is the VOR radial that I want to be on, bracketing is the process of figuring that out. So you fly this heading and you're like, oh, no, that didn't work. You fly this heading and then over time you figure out, okay, that's the heading that holds my line perfectly. That's called bracketing. That's kind of what the professional operators do to stay safe. They bracket towards safety. And they do it in a 3-step process. And it's very simple. The first thing is they notice the accidents. It sounds obvious, but it's not that easy. Like, for example, I was walking to this talk this morning and I was thinking to myself, I haven't heard of any accidents flying into Oshkosh this year. Usually there's an accident or two, somebody coming in. I haven't heard about it. And I honestly don't know if there have or have not been any accidents. But I do know there could very well have been, and I don't know about it. That's very possible. There are many days where I'm teaching, and I teach, regularly, and I'm sitting in my office in between lessons. My next student will come in and say, hey, did you hear about that crash this morning in Hayward? I have no idea. What are you talking about? I've been flying all morning. How would I know? Unless it's on the news and I happen to turn on the 5 o'clock news, which I don't happen to do very often, then I won't know about it. Most of us don't know about it. So looking at the professionals, the people we're trying to emulate, they do know about it, and they don't just look at it for that company that crashed. I mean, if United has an accident, the entire professional world looks at that accident, and they look closely at it, and they figure out, how did this thing happen? What were the circumstances? What were the pressures? Is it possible? And we move to step 2 for them. I said this is a 3-step process. The second step is figuring out a procedure that would prevent that accident from occurring again. And then the third step in the process, make the procedure redundant and force compliance. Through that 3-step process, professional operators have reduced their fatal accident rate by 83%. They've bracketed towards safety. And some people might say, oh, what are you talking about, Jason? They're flying airplanes with 2 engines, and they've got hot leading edges and these fancy systems and all that. Anybody who's flown a complex airplane knows that complexity does not equal safety. Complexity equals the possibility for more error. So it's not, like if you look at a fleet of airplanes on the ramp and you've got like a Citabria and a 210 and a Mooney and a Pitts and a King Air, the safest one out there is probably the Citabria. It's like the most simple airplane there, right? I shouldn't have picked the tail wheel. 152. 152. Okay. Anyway, so that's how the professional operators are doing it. And we, in the world of general aviation, need to emulate that process. And as teachers, we need to teach that process is the key to safety. That is the little golden key that will unlock the chest of safety. What's happening instead of that, in fact, on a positive note, Mark Baker said the other night at an AOPA thing that this has been the safest year in general aviation, or last year was the safest year in general aviation. Was it ever? Or in many, many decades, right? So we are trending in the right direction, but for the longest time, it never changed, just a flat line. And if you look at the accident reports, you'll just see it. If you start to read the NTSB reports, you think, man, I read that 2 months ago. I read an accident like that 4 months ago. Someone did that last month, right? You start thinking, gosh, if these pilots that are crashing in July had only read about the accidents from June, they might not have had those accidents. So step 1 is being aware of it. And if you happen to be a pilot that researches accidents, and some people feel bad about that, like, oh, I'm a little morbid, I'm looking up all these crash things online and stuff like that. It's a healthy process for pilots. As long as it doesn't lead you to a place of anxiety, it's a healthy process. Because you can look at what other people are doing, the mistakes they're making, and you can move to step 2 for yourself.
I'm talking about that tomorrow.
Are you? Which one?
How to study aircraft accidents.
Awesome. All right, so Brian's doing it at 8? What time?
Tomorrow at 9 a.m.
Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Brian Schiff is going to be talking about how to study aircraft accidents. It's awesome. Because that is step 1 in this critical process. Step 2 is figuring out a procedure that would prevent the possibility of an accident from occurring. So let me think of an example. 2007, in Lexington, Kentucky, a regional airliner lined up with the wrong runway when there were co-joined, departure, what do you call it? Arrival ends, whatever. Where they were turning onto the runway, they turned this way instead of that way. So there's 2 runways with the same little bit of pavement. They went down the wrong runway. It wasn't long enough. There weren't lights. Everybody on board was killed, I think, except the first officer. It was a horrible accident. So I happened to be sitting in a pilot's lounge in Santa Monica right around this time. And just a bunch of other pilots in the room, their feet kicked up, and I just making conversation like, hey, did anybody hear about that crash over in Lexington? Oh, yeah, we heard about that. And then the second question, hey, did anybody's procedures change as a result of that? And almost in unison, all the professional pilots, oh yeah, now what we have to do is, and they described the procedure. They described the thing that their company told them, because their company studied that accident, figured out what procedure would work, and then made the procedure redundant and forced compliance. And so the procedure they described to me is, well, now, when we line up with the runway, the pilot flying has to call out the magnetic compass heading, the pilot monitoring has to verify that he said the right thing. There's a process. They had to talk about briefing to get onto the runway, so they, from where, as they were taxiing, they had to have a briefing. There was a sterile cockpit thing, they weren't allowed to talk. So there's all these little procedures that are going into place. So I'm listening to these folks, and I go back to San Carlos the next day, and I'm sitting with my student in a lesson, and I just said, hey, look, we've got a new set of procedures that we're going to adopt. And I just adopted the procedures that those folks told me. right? So we are going to out loud brief how we're going to go. We're going to have a sterile cockpit. When we line up with the runway, we're going to check our magnetic compass. We're going to call it out. So that's, in that way, we're going to sort of, that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about bracketing safety. Now, just one second, because I don't want to forget this thought. The third part of the process was make it redundant and force compliance, right? So when we're just talking about bracketing safety, we notice the accidents, we make a procedure, we make it redundant, and we force compliance. Redundancy in a single pilot environment is a bit tricky. Did you have something before I go on?
I was going to say, the only way to do this across everybody,
Yeah.
when an aircraft has this problem and they say, hey, this Cessna has a problem with the rudder or whatever, there's an airworthiness directive that comes out from the FAA.
All right, let's hold that thought for a minute, because I just want to focus on pilot behavior just for a second.
Pilot directives need to come down from the FAA saying, this is a problem, people are losing control, they're not doing energy management, or whatever it is.
All right, I'm not pro-regulating this process, just for the record. I don't want to see this process regulated by the government, just to be clear. But I do think we have to regulate ourselves, and that's a good segue, because that is by far the hardest part of this process, right? Has anyone ever owned a motorcycle? Okay, I won't let myself buy a motorcycle. And I promised my kids I wouldn't. Honestly, because I'll tell myself for the first 6 months that I'm going to ride really safe, but then one day I'm going to be late and my wife's going to be waiting at this restaurant for me and I had to drop off the kids and I'm going to ride like a fool. I just know how that goes. It's very difficult to force yourself, to constrain yourself in this way. The professionals have leverage, right? They will fire you. They will listen to tapes maybe randomly in the cockpit. They will see if you're behaving in the way that they want you to behave, and if you're not, they will fire you. And there goes your kid's college or whatever, your pension. So pro pilots don't mess with it. In our world, we have to make it redundant and we have to force our compliance. In just a moment, let's talk about redundancy. And who you want to emulate in this case, by the way, is look for, if you believe me and you walk out of here inspired, you want to look at single pilot commercial operators. Those are the people that we're going to emulate. We're not going to emulate people that fly with two crews, even though I've been talking about United and American and all these airlines. Their redundancy is easy. 2 pilots up front, that's redundant. That's it, right? 4 ears, 2 brains, 4 eyes, it's all redundant. In a single pilot world like Ameriflight or Pac Valley or any number of other successful single pilot professional operators, they use different tools for redundancy. And one of the most powerful tools you have for redundancy is speaking out loud. So as much as possible, even if you need to isolate yourself because you don't want to sound, like a fool for your passengers or whatever, isolate yourself. But speaking out loud is some form of redundancy in a single pilot world. The best example I can think of is when you call somebody the wrong name, and as it comes out of your mouth, you hear it. Or yesterday, like I was doing a talk for ForeFlight, and I mentioned an ADS-B receiver, and I accidentally said Stratus instead of Century. On a tape, right? They're recording it, and I go Stratus, and I can hear it coming out of my mouth. That's not good, right? So, but that's redundancy. My ears are like, dude, that's the wrong thing. So that is redundancy. And so in our world, when we need redundancy, that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is guess first, check second. So everyone hears about using checklists, use your checklist. Well, if you use your checklist the way a 2 crew member system would use it, that is pick it up and read it, that's not redundant. That's only redundant in the 2 crew environment because there's another person listening. So if the climb checklist is powerful, mixture in, cowl flaps open, check your oil pressure, oil temperature, whatever, if you're reading that and just doing each thing as you read it, the possibility exists that you're going to skip a line and not even know it. And you're not checking anything. And if you guys need a manual to fly, like if you don't know what you're supposed to do in the climb, we have bigger problems. We'll go work on that, right? So it's not like you're just reading this, what am I supposed to do here in the climb? If there was a person next to you listening, that'd be redundant. But in our world, we have to guess first. So you can come up with like a flow check. Just maybe start at your magnetic compass, make sure your heading looks good, check your engine gauges, check your power, mixture, cowl flaps, fuel. I like that lightning bolt flow. I use it for everything, just like that lightning bolt shape. I don't have multiple flows. I just have one flow in a light airplane. Looks like a lightning bolt. But ask yourself, is there anything to be done? And guess what? If you miss something, no big deal, because you're about to pick up a list and check yourself as a second thing. And that two-step process is super important. Very, very important. Night and day. Picking up a checklist and reading it is not redundant. Guessing first and checking second is redundant. Okay, and so you want to establish that redundancy. By the way, if you're a CFI, use caution. All of your students will eventually try to drop the check part. So I teach this to students, and there comes a point where I have to say to them, look, if you're just going to go to flow checks, I'd rather have you read the checklist. Right? That's a better habit to have. But neither one of those things is redundant unless you do them both together. So you have to check first, guess second. You could also use mnemonic devices like the 5 A's or acronyms like GUMPS. Doesn't really matter. Any of those guesses first, checking second is a redundant process. And then the last step is just the hardest part, forcing your own compliance. How do you force your own compliance with this stuff? This is all part of the first thing in the top 10 talk, by the way. And we're about to move into the second thing, which is standardizing your flying, right? So all of this, bracketing safety, leads you to a set of procedures that you have that is going to standardize the way you operate the airplane. Okay, so what do I mean by standardize the way you operate your airplane? You guys have heard when you walk up to the airplane to do a pre-flight, it sort of starts when you walk up to the airplane, right? You're looking at the airplane and you're seeing if the tie-down chains are on, or if the pitot tube cover's been left off, is there a fuel cap left off? So immediately you're into this process of putting on your pilot brain. And I believe that there is a kind of ritual transformation that can occur, right? Like, so you ever heard that thing where if you study drunk, you should take the test drunk? Did anyone ever tell you that? I'm not talking about flying, but just in yeah, because it's the way you did it, right? So a similar thing, there's a kind of transformation when you casting off your stresses of the workday, you're walking out to the airplane, there should be some sort of ritualistic aspect to the way you're approaching becoming a pilot and flying this mission. All right, so an example of a procedure, the final walk around after the pre-flight. You guys do that, where you do a full 360? All right, so let me just give you a list of my standard procedures from that moment all the way up to the point where I might relax, kick the seat back a little bit, and think, okay, now I can do whatever I want. There will be a final walk around after the pre-flight. When I sit down in the airplane, I will either brief whoever's sitting next to me or expect them to brief me, no matter how many times we've sat down together. So if it's a student that I've been flying with every day, doesn't matter. When I sit down in that seat, student turns to me and says, here's how the door works, here's how the seatbelt works, whatever their standard briefing is for passengers, I expect them to give that to me every single time. After engine start, we've completed all the checklists, we're sitting there, we've got the ATIS, whatever, there should be a taxi diagram up, and we brief the taxi route before the airplane moves. So if it's a towered airport at San Carlos and they say taxi 30 run-up area via Juliet, we read it back, 30 run-up area via Juliet. Then we pull up the taxi diagram, we look at the route, and we confirm there are no hotspots. And this is stuff that's said out loud. So, and this is kind of a sterile cockpit environment because this is a critical phase of the flight. Once we get past 1,000 and we're off on our way, we're going to relax, have fun. You can listen to music, whatever you like to do in the airplane. There's other ways to relax. But for this critical phase, for this takeoff, this is the way we're going to ritualize it. All right, so we brief the taxi route. During the taxi, we perform the taxi turns, which verify that all the gyroscopic instruments are working, that the headings are all decreasing when we turn left, increasing when we turn right. The ball goes to the outside, the turn coordinator moves in the right direction, or if you're glass, the slab goes to the outside, the pink line moves in the right direction, whatever. You get out to the run-up area, they use an acronym called CIGARS. Have you guys ever heard that? CIGARS is we're gonna guess first, check second, like we just said with bracketing. CIGARS is controls, free and correct. Instruments, looking good. Gas is on the right tank. Fuel quantity and totalizer, depending on what you're flying, right? So this is like an accordion. It can get bigger or smaller. Attitude trim, all trims and autopilot. Attitude trim was old, it's been turned into all trims. And autopilot, radios run up, seatbelt security, and switches. And then you do all that stuff. Sorry, radios run up if I didn't say that. And then you check it against the checklist. All right? We're ready to go. Nothing drives me more crazy when I'm sitting with the pilot, we finish the run-up and they just turn to me and say, "Are you ready?" Which I always say, "Sure, I'm ready," and then they just key the mic and we go. Especially if we've never flown together before. So what I'd like to see is a pre-takeoff briefing. If we're really about to go here, what's going to happen? How much runway do we have? What's the abort point? What are the winds doing? What's 1,000 feet above the ground? So we know, like let's just brief it. Here at Oshkosh, I think we're at 800 feet, right? So 1,800 would be 1,000 feet above. In Chicago, I think it's more like 700. Where I am at sea level, right? So you want to kind of brief this stuff before you go. What's going to happen in the event of an emergency? Am I going to take the plane? Are you going to take the plane? What action items are we going to hit? So you want to kind of get in front of the airplane before it starts moving. If you can't do that, another problem. So get in front of the airplane. Then we, get out on the runway. We have takeoff callouts, power set, gauges checked, airspeed alive, rotate, no runway, and then 500 and 1,000. And at that point, we're on our way. At 1,000 feet, we do a flow check and a climb checklist. And at that point, the sterile cockpit environment goes away. Assuming everything looks good, we can now relax and fly up to the cruise altitude. Well, let's talk about the concept then of personal minimums. This is number 3 on our list, on our top 10 list here. We've learned how to bracket safety. We've talked about standardizing our operations. Let's talk a little bit about personal minimums. And again, we're going to emulate what the professionals do. Are there any airline pilots here besides Brian? All right. No? Anyway, well, in the professional world, here's just a truth. You may not start an instrument approach. You may not cross the final approach fix of an instrument approach if the weather for the airport has gone below minimums. So if Brian's flying his airliner into an airport and he picks up the weather and realizes the weather has gone below minimums, he may not go start the approach if you're outside the final approach fix, right? That's something they don't do. Why don't they do it? Because somewhere in the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s, so many people died trying that. Well, I'll just go take a look and see if I can see the runway. So many people died doing that they just said, let's just take that decision out of the equation. You're not allowed to do that anymore. Okay, and if you're not allowed to do that, I don't think there have been that many accidents of that type since, right? So that's the idea behind personal minimums. From the comfort of our tent, or living room or dining room table or whatever, we are going to invent things that we will not do very objectively. If this, then that. Like if it's this much wind, I won't go. If the clouds aren't this high, I won't go. It's a little bit different than the standard ritual, ritualizing your flying that I was just talking about, but it's an important piece of what is now becoming your personal operations manual. And I do recommend writing it down in that way, right? Like you are going to be your own chief pilot. We're trying to emulate the professionals. We established that up front here, 20 minutes ago. We want to be like the pros because they are the most successful in coming home every time. And so you want to write down all of this. What is my ritual? What are my minimums? And so personal minimums, it's not like it's a complete list and you write it once and it's done. You'll never add to it. This is a living document, so start anywhere. It doesn't have to be complete. Just say, here's a headwind limit. Here's a crosswind limit. Or if it's more complicated than that, here's a headwind limit when I'm flying a Citabria. Here's a headwind limit when I'm flying my 210 or whatever. You can make it as, try not to make it too complicated, but they're yours. They're for you. And you are going to write these minimums down. You're going to write your ritual down. That's going to be your operations manual. And you are going to give that to a CFI or a pilot friend or something like that. You are going to hold yourself accountable as much as possible by letting somebody else in on what your operations manual looks like. When I was talking about riding the motorcycle and trying to control my own behavior, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it is sometimes tricky to be diligent about this. And there's one student I always think of when I'm trying to describe how hard this can be, but I have a personal limit in San Carlos when I'm teaching. It's always windy. Does anyone know San Carlos in California? It's always windy when the fog recedes and the runway is not lined up properly, so it's always a crosswind. And it's typically, a typical summer day at San Carlos is like 17 or 18 knots, gusting 20, 25. That's like normal. And probably 20 or 30 degrees off the left. A lot of mechanical turbulence. So I tell my students, they always ask me, is it too windy to fly? So I just tell them up front, look, if it's gusting 24, we're not going to go. If it's 23, we're going to go. But if it's 24, we're not going to go. And that's what it is. That's our limit. So I had this student come out. His name was Alan. Super excited. Private pilots are always really excited to fly. They want to come out. They want to fly. And I could feel it. Right? It's super excited. And I'm with him for an hour. We do our whole pre-flight plan. We talk about the objective of the lesson, what we're going to go out and do. We have ground on the aerodynamics behind it all. And then he goes out, and we're pre-flighting the airplane. So we've been together for about an hour and a half. And he's, unfortunately paying me for that time. And we sit down in the airplane. We pick up the ATIS, and sure enough, it's gusting 24. We had to cancel the flight, right? We had to cancel the flight. But it's hard. That's not easy to tell Alan, you know what, we're not flying. Because he's thinking it's 1 knot, dude. 1 knot. But what would be the lesson? What would I have taught him if I said, it's just 1 knot. Like, this time we're going to go. I would have pulled the rug out from under everything I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes, right? I would have taught him the exact opposite. I would have taught him that it's fine. Yeah, and you have to be really careful. There was another time, and I'll just tell you these stories because I think they stick in your head as a good memory, but I had a student in a 152. We fly out, if you know the area, we're out at Tracy Airport, which is like 25 miles away, and I don't normally go on check rides with my students. If it's normally I don't. Yeah, I just kind of send them out, endorse them, let them do their thing with the examiner. In this case, it was a new examiner. I wanted to meet him. I'd never met him before, so I'm out there. And my daughter was at private school up in San Francisco, and my wife was working, I was working, and the time, they're taking forever on this check ride, right? Forever. And they finally come back, they pass. I had to fly back to San Carlos and then get in Bay Area traffic to go up and pick up my kid from school, who I just imagined was probably sitting on a street corner somewhere in San Francisco, right? Waiting for me. And my student comes back, he passed his check ride. We've pre-flighted this airplane twice now. So we pre-flighted it before we left San Carlos. He pre-flighted it for the check ride. We pre-flight it again to leave. As patiently as I can, I don't rush him. And on the way out to the runway, he says, do we have to do another run-up? Now, a student run-up takes about 25 or 30 minutes, if you haven't done a student run-up. This is not just like, power to 17, check your stuff and move on. This is going to be a minute. And just, biting my cheek, I said, of course. Of course we have to do the run-up, right? We have to do everything the way we've always done everything, even if my kid is sitting on a street corner in San Francisco somewhere. That's irrelevant in that moment. And that's the kind of diligence you have to have as a GA pilot. And don't forget, the hardest part of everything we've talked about today is when it really matters. When I'm late for dinner, not when I'm comfortable and it's a beautiful day and I can go, I'll do everything slowly. That's easy. But when you're pressured, that's hard, and that's where GA pilots sometimes lose it. So don't forget that. All right, where are we here? We're definitely not going to get through all 10. That's 3. All right, so I may jump ahead a little bit here. Dealing with anxiety in the airplane is number 4. I don't know if anyone's experienced this, but it's not all that uncommon throughout your entire career as a pilot. If you fly long enough, there are times where you may not feel comfortable in the airplane for various reasons. And I get these emails all the time, sometimes from student pilots, sometimes from experienced pilots. Like, hey, how do I deal with it? I'm just so anxious. Like when I fly with my CFI, this is the one I get all the time. When I fly with my CFI, I'm fine. But then my kids and my wife come and my CFI is not there anymore. And I just get butterflies and I feel like I'm missing something, like that kind of anxiety. Like, am I really good enough to do this? And I really think that the antidote, if you've ever experienced that type of thing, the antidote is more training. And if we're going to emulate what the professionals do, how often do professional pilots have to go back into recurrent training? Every 6 months, right? So if you don't have a relationship with a CFI where you can go back every 6 months, you should try to find that. And in a perfect world, you have somebody local who's not gone to the airlines, who's a CFI that you know, who knows your operations manual, who has your list of personal minimums and your list of procedures, and you've had a conversation with that person like, hey, I saw this guy Jason at Oshkosh who recommended this person, this operations manual. Will you please look at this, because this is the stuff I want you to hold me accountable to. Even if that's not the way you teach it, please hold me accountable to my SOPs, my standard operating procedures. So anyway, recurrent training and feeling the edges of the envelope. I had one student Can't remember his name, but he was in this exact situation. And he was a private with an instrument working on his commercial. And every time he flew with me, he was fine, but he didn't like flying with his wife. And so we went out and we just pushed the envelope a bit, did stalls, did some spin recovery, did slow flight, like just, MCA, hanging on the prop with the stall horn on until he's comfortable, covering the flight instruments. Just really I think about it like lifting weights and putting weights on the barbell. Like he may not lift that much every time, of course, but we're just trying to get those muscles going so that when he goes out with his wife, it just feels like spinning a baton. It's like nothing, because he's done all this heavy work, right? That is the antidote to anxiety. All right, we're going to number 5 now. Flying with passengers and kids. Does anyone fly with their kids? All right. This is a lot. And I'll be honest, I flew a pressurized 210 out I have a 4-year-old daughter, a 12-year-old daughter, and my wife, Jess. And I brought a co-pilot this time. I've never done that before, which, by the way, is a huge luxury. I didn't realize. I have wealthy clients who sometimes fly with co-pilots, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. But when you do it, it's actually quite nice to have another pilot in the right seat. And this allowed one of us, at least, to deal with the family. And there's always something. So if you can, when you're flying with your kids and your family, especially on long missions, get a pilot friend to come with you or get somebody else in the right seat. It'll make a big difference. But if you can't, when you're flying alone, make sure that you have a good, clear briefing, which is probably something you've practiced before. Make sure that everybody understands there are times where you're not going to be able to talk to them. I always get this. I'll be talking to air traffic control, just getting ready to take off, and my 12-year-old will say, "Dad, the Bluetooth isn't working on my headset." Oh, God. It's like, stand by. Yeah, right? Abort this takeoff. Abort the takeoff. Yeah, so, and you just, it's always, and my family flies with me all the time. It's not like they don't know I'm busy on takeoff. I mean, come on. Really? So just have a clear conversation with them, but at the end of the day, what's really going to save your bacon? The isolation button. Do you guys know about the isolation button on the audio panel? Okay, isolate yourself. And I think it's fair to even tell people that that's what you're going to do. So if we kind of jump back to number 1 and we're talking about bracketing safety and all that whole ritual, right? Maybe from the ground to 1,000, you're like the airline pilot who closed the door. Maybe that's what you did. Maybe you went ISO and you're able to talk to yourself. They don't even hear you. You can go through all that ritual, kind of slow your mind down and get back into what it feels like when you're with your CFI who's holding you accountable to all that stuff. And all of a sudden you're just back in training doing something that you really know. And then at a certain point, after you do that climb checklist and you lean your seat back, you can turn on your music and then solve your daughter's Bluetooth problem, right? There it goes. All right. We are going to jump ahead a little bit here, I think, to 9 and 10. Sorry, we skipped 6, 7, 8, which was VFR emergencies flying at night and VFR into IMC. We're going to hold those for a second and go to number 9, which is decide on the ground. That's kind of a tough one. There are some tools we use as pilots which are a bit abstract, yet I still recommend. Like one I can think of is the 3 strikes rule. Does anybody have that? Anything like that? Okay. That's pretty vague. Like, what does that mean? What is a strike? What isn't a strike? And for anybody that doesn't know what that is, it's me keeping tabs on myself. And it could be anything. Like, sometimes I'm walking around looking for my sunglasses and they're on my head. That kind of thing. Where you're like, where was my brain? Or they're in my hand, or I'm walking around looking for keys to the car, but I'm holding them in my hand, and I'm looking around for 10 minutes to try to find those keys, and I look in my hand. That's a strike. I don't know what it means. It just means I'm not fully here. And so if I have 3 events like that before I get out to the airplane and take off, I consider myself struck out, right? I will maybe take a minute and pause. By the way, speaking of taking a minute, we didn't talk about this in the standard procedures, but I have one student who literally takes a minute, and it's a really profound, I keep meaning to add it to my procedures, where when we sit down in the plane with him, in his own plane, he owns a Cirrus, we'll get in his airplane, and the doors are open, and he'll say, "Are you ready to go?" And I'll say, "I'm ready." He'll hit a timer for a minute, and we sit there in silence just for a minute. That slows things down. That's a really good procedure. So take a minute. Anyway, that's the 3 strikes rule. So decide on the ground is another thing it's maybe powerful to remember, but also a little vague. And let's just talk about it. Nothing scares me more than my California students coming out to the East Coast to fly, because they don't, especially in the summer, because they don't know anything about weather in California. And in California, it's either foggy or windy. We have two modes, foggy and windy. That's it. In the winter time, it's much more complicated. But in the summer, as long as you're not in the mountains, it's foggy or windy. So I had these two students that bought 172s. Both of them bought, two 172s out in Virginia, and they wanted to fly out to Virginia together, pick up these 172s and fly back to California, and they wanted to take me out to lunch so I could give them some pointers. Like, I'm going to say something over lunch that's going to make a difference, right? So on my way to McDonald's, which is where they were going to take me, I'm thinking, what can I tell these guys? Like, what could I possibly say over a Big Mac that's going to make a difference in their life? And the only thing I could think was, just based on my own experience, there are going to come times in this journey where you're wrestling with something. Like, should we land in St. Louis or should we push on to like Omaha? We have enough fuel for Omaha, but there's this going on and there's weather coming in and, this kind of thing. And it'll become a tough call. Like, as you're flying along, you're not quite sure exactly what you should do. In those moments, you should land the airplane and make the decision on the ground. And if you decide going to Omaha was definitely the best thing to do, you can take off and go to Omaha. But I promise you, 95% of the time, once those wheels are on the ground, it's going to become very clear that you should have been on the ground, right? That'll help you also when it comes to fatigue, which I think Brian and I were talking about the other day. Fatigue is one of the most insidious of all the things. And like a thing I like to tell people, because I want to be honest and I'm not proud of it, but is that I could probably tell you a dozen stories, probably, of times I got out of the airplane and thought I shouldn't have been flying because I was too tired. Like my partner and I coming back from ForeFlight, one time we landed in Palm Springs at like 11:30. My in-laws have a place in Palm Springs, but we're like 2 hours from San Francisco. We've been flying all the way from, so we decided to just push on. So we land in San Francisco at 1:30 in the morning. We both look at each other and say we should have stayed in Palm Springs. Right? We made it, but that wasn't the right call, right? So fatigue is really hard. The other side of that story, the part I'm not proud of, is that I don't think I could tell you one story, probably not even one, when the mission really, really mattered. Like, I had to get to a meeting, or I had to get to a lesson, or I had to get to a wedding, or something like that, when it really mattered, and I said, no, I'm too tired to fly. I can't think of one of those. So if you look at that data that I just gave you, 12 stories about I was too tired to do it, but not one that stopped me before I did it, that's noticeable to me as like analyzing myself. That means I'm not very good at figuring out when I'm too tired. And I don't know if anybody else is, but I find that to be a very sort of insidious hazard. And so deciding on the ground, 2 minutes? All right. Deciding on the ground is you'll know it when you need it, and when you need it, you'll be happy you landed. All right, the last thing is to just always fly with an out. I think that sounds pretty obvious, but sometimes it requires a bit of thought. There was one time I was flying through Oregon over smoke on my way to Seattle, and I'm fully IFR capable. I'm flying a DA-40 with a G1000. I thought, well, heck, if it gets too smoky here, I'll just pick up an IFR clearance. So I'm flying along, and sure enough, I'm thinking, it's pretty smoky. I'll get an IFR clearance. So I contact center, say I'd like to pick up an IFR clearance. They say, sure, just climb to 16,000. We'll give you a transponder code here. You'll be on your way. It's like, I can't climb to 16,000 in a DA-40. The MEAs, I hadn't checked the MEAs. And I realized in that moment I'd flown myself into a bit of a corner. I was IFR capable, but the airplane wasn't capable of reaching the MEAs in my area. The smoke was rising, and I was now pinched between those two things, right? So you want to, as much as possible, avoid, obviously, painting yourself into that corner and making sure that you're always flying with some out, making sure you always know where that out is. I think we may be out of time. All right, well, you all, this is my website. If you want to hear more on that sort of stuff, I'm sorry we didn't get through all 10. Thank you guys so much for being the early birds.